not happen in Cuba for generations, and of course the issue of police brutality, which is, you would never have the police terror that we are witnessing in the United States against against the black community like you have here, and that would not happen in Cuba. And there's of course all the other issues, the free health care. You can be a doctor, you can go to university and not have this huge, tremendously expensive debt over your head when you get out of college, and other, it's the most sustainable country in the world. Cuba is the most sustainable country in the world, and so forth and so on. So, yeah, we can point to the tremendous gains that the socialist revolution, that the Cuban Revolution has carried out, and highlight the differences between a country that puts its people before the banks and before Pentagon and before profits, and is able to take its meager resources and carry out, these tremendous gains that very few people in the world have at all. It's just like a very unique situation thanks to socialist Cuba. So I want to talk a little bit about why, because a lot of people ask and want to figure out are there some efforts among some sectors of the ruling class who do want, not so much to lift the blockade, who don't want so much to, have an equal, of course, because what country does the U.S. have an equal relationship with? None. Even other capitalist, countries, they bully and so forth and so on. But the reason why there is an effort to lift some parts of the blockade is because capitalist interests in the United States, especially agribusiness, needs more markets. They need to sell their junk. They need, the tourist industry and Google and other corporations are eager and chopping at the bits to get into Cuba. And those are some of the advances that are happening. And we have to be prepared for that. We have to be prepared. And one of the things that we know happens in the movement is, oh my God, is capitalism coming to Cuba? And yes, there are changes, and yes, there might be some McDonald's, or there might be some, I'm not sure of that. I'm just sort of talking out loud. There might be some. No, we don't want McDonald's there, but there might be something, but we don't want the U.S. flag to be flying over Cuba either. It's just a reality of the Cuban Revolution. But whatever effect that comes from some normalization of relations, whatever corporation, or even like the building of malls. I remember one of the times that I went to Cuba and they were building malls. I was like, yuck, but the Cubans were saying it's nice to go someplace where it's air conditioned inside, so it's like, okay, like we can't look at the changes there through our eyes. But whatever differences occur, we are very confident about the Cubans. We're very confident, not just because we know that innately workers want to improve their lives, and workers don't want to go back, to the days before the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban people don't want Haiti situation in their country. They don't want a situation like in Mexico. No one wants that. So they're going to fight like hell to defend their gains, and they're going to fight like hell to defend their sovereignty. That we know. And we know that the Cuban leadership is an extraordinary leadership. And anything that one hears about the differences between Fidel and Raúl, anything that you hear that Raúl is perhaps more pro-capitalist or more for market reforms, you say Raúl is as much a Marxist-Leninist as Fidel. Raúl just as much wants to defend the socialist nature of Cuba as Fidel. And they are one and the same. The Cuban leadership is one and the same, just like the Cuban leadership with the people is one and the same. After, just a day or two after Obama left, Comrade Fidel, who is, of course, not writing as much as he used to, but he did write a letter and a statement, and it was entitled Brother Obama. And in it, you know, in the most poetic and, you know, thoughtful and inspiring and high-level way, you know, just sort of talked about Cuba's history and reminded the empire that the Cuban people will fight by any means necessary to defend their revolution. And he reminded the empire about their success in Angola. And he reminded the empire about the seeds of Jose Marti that flow in the blood of every single Cuban. And he, you know, made it clear that they were not going back, whether the U.S. president had come to Cuba or not. And, you know, you have to read what Fidel writes several times, and you owe it to yourself and to him, you know, to read what he says several times. Because despite the fact that Fidel is a Marxist-Leninist revolution and someone who has been born once in a lifetime, and we will probably not see another Fidel in this hemisphere for another time, because he is so unique, you have to read what he says. And the way that he explained how you know, everything is beyond one person. But he talked about the U.S. flag, how they would defend the U.S. flag without any doubt. He talks about the blood that was shed by one of the primary black leaders of the Cuban Revolution, Antonio Maceo. And of course, he reminds the empire about the Bay of Pigs defeat. And mind you, that the Bay of Pigs defeat was just a year or two after the triumph of the revolution. And now you have a population that's much more class conscious, and you have a population that is armed, that knows how to defend itself, knows, you know, every block knows what to do in case the U.S. invades. Everyone is organized for that. You know, been reminded the empire about that. And then he ends his talk with just a beautiful statement, and everybody should read it. But I also want to close with the article that was written in Granma, which is, of course, the organ of the Cuban Communist Party, and, you know, it really reflects what I'm sure is the official view of the Cuban Communist Party and the Cuban leadership. And, you know, really, if anyone doubted that the visit of Barack Obama meant a softening of Cuba's revolutionary zeal, you just have to read this article to know that the Cubans will defend to their death, and that there is no divisions at all among the leadership. And he concludes his article, and this is I'm going to end with. Obama concluded his visit to Cuba. He was, along with his beautiful family, for whom Cubans have a natural affection, welcomed, treated, and bid farewell politely by people and authorities who are proud of their hospitality, respect, and willingness to dialogue without impositions, but whose majorities are well aware of the land on which they stand and are bursting with the sovereign spirit of Martí and Fidel. That spirit which was evident as the entire Latin American stadium chanted, Raúl, Raúl, Raúl. The fact that the first U.S. president has come to Cuba in, you know, so many years is, of course, a result of the fact that, you know, comments have pointed out that the blockade policy of trying to isolate Cuba, to try to undermine the Cuban Revolution, the economic sabotage, the assassination attempts, trying to isolate Cuba, have all failed. Nothing has worked from the U.S. to overturn the Cuban Revolution. And part of the reason, if not the main reason, that this has happened is because of Fidel's leadership, above all. And it's important to note that when Obama arrived in Cuba, Fidel did not meet with him. And he could have met with him, because he meets with dignitaries all the time. I mean, not as much as he used to, but he could have met with him, and he didn't. And this is important. This is important, to show, you're here, but you're at our, because we're strong, And part of the reason why the Cuban Revolution is so strong is because from day one, the Cuban leadership have prepared the Cuban masses for this difficulty, and from day one, when the revolution triumphed, Fidel told the people it was going to be even more difficult from now on. And this is after they had kicked out Batista, and they kicked out the corporations that were using women, Cuban women, as prostitutes, when, the unemployment and wages were just like in the United States, if not worse, really more like Haiti and the Dominican Republic and so forth. So there was a reason to be happy, and there was reason to be euphoric when these corporations and Batista were kicked out. But Fidel, from day one, said things are going to get more difficult now. And it was to prepare and strengthen the Cuban people for U.S. imperialism. In the article that was written by Grandma later on, by one of the Cuban comrades, whose name I'm forgetting, they made a very good point to point out about how Obama, which is what we've said, when he got elected, of course, when Obama got elected the first time, it was one of the worst economic crises in a very long time. And, what more perfect tool that the imperialists and the capitalists could have than a man of color to, carry out the attacks, the deportations, to say nothing about the deaths of black people by the hands of the police forces. He was a perfect tool. And the Cubans point that out about Obama as well, in a very diplomatic and careful way, like he's charismatic, he looks like us, but he still represents the empire, and they made that quite clear. And Fidel says, when he makes a comment about something that Obama said, and he says that Obama made a speech in which he uses the most sweetened words to express. Obama says, it's time now to forget the past. Leave the past behind, and let us be friends and family as neighbors together. And Fidel says, I suppose all of us were at risk of a heart attack upon hearing these words from the President of the United States. And he went on to talk about the blockade, the deaths, the special period, that really it was important that John raised the special period, because any other country, capitalist country, that had lost 85% of its trade, any other country that had experienced the hunger that it experienced in those periods, people had to get up at 4 in the morning because they had to walk to work because there was no oil for the buses. Any other country would have had massive, massive protests. Any other country would have had to take out its armed repressive forces and turn their guns on the people. This did not happen in Cuba. There was hunger and sacrifice, but if there was only 2 eggs, those 2 eggs were distributed among 10 people. Everything was shared. So Dolores' question about a successor, I haven't heard anything, and it really reminds me that I really need to go to Cuba, because it is important for Spanish-speaking people to go to Cuba, because you get a little nuance and you get some insight that, that's important. Not that you get a lot even if you don't speak Spanish, don't get me wrong, but there's a little extra spice, when you can speak the language. Of course, it's just obvious. So I haven't heard anything, but we don't need to worry. I'm sure that there is probably a dozen successors. It could be Ilian, It could be Ilean's father. It could be one of the Cuban Five. I believe when the Cuban comrades say that the Cuban Five who sacrificed their lives, who were willing to die and go to jail and be in the belly of the beast, the prisons of the belly of the beast here, that they're not just five like that. There are many Cuban Fives in Cuba, and I'm confident of that because we've met them. We've met them in the streets. We meet them in the schools. And so we're confident that, there's somebody there. Now, Cuba's not perfect. Like the Cuban comrades say, we're not the hell that our enemies describe us, but we're not the paradise that our friends describe us either. And it's true, like something that I read from Fidel recently. He wrote this recently. He used the word mankind. And I'm like, come on, Fidel, But it's sort of like, it's not in their whatever. Women have not brought it to their attention that, why can't you say, humanity or people? Women have just, it's not a priority. And when you have the ability to be a doctor or a judge or get divorced whenever you want to, those things just don't matter. And maybe also, we cannot judge Cuba from our eyes. We can't. And it's very important. But they have a point. Why don't the Cubans make it a point to raise all the black Cubans that have died for the Cuban Revolution, like Antonio Maceo? It's like, but you can tell the Cubans that, and they're like, no, but it's different here. And you're kind of like, okay, we know it's different, but try to show Cuba how, from the eyes of how U.S. people, especially activists, might see it, and just try, but they don't get it. We've told them many times, you can go to Cuba and they'll have a panel of whatever, and it's all men. And you can tell them, why is it all men? Come on. It's not that they don't have the women, and the women will say, it doesn't matter to us. So, you can't go there with a microscope either, right? And you can't tell them this is how it should be, because the basis of solidarity and the basis of freedom for every single Cuban people has been laid. It's there. The playing field has been leveled for every black, every woman, every worker in Cuba. And, so, okay, we're not going to tell them that, but, it's a little thing. So it's not perfect. And with regards to the trans question, institutionally, no trans person, no queer person at all can be fired for being queer in any way. You cannot prevent housing like you can here. And you sure as hell is not going to get beaten or killed to death for being trans like you do here in the United States. That does not happen in Cuba and will never happen. Whatever lags there are in advances on the gay question in Cuba come from 500 years of colonialism. They don't come from 50 years of revolution. It's sort of lagging, because it's only been 50 years. And there's been great advances. And like the leader of Senexes is the Cuban Sex Center. She is Raul's daughter, Mariela Castro, and she comes often to the United States to talk about trans rights, right, and gay rights and all that. But she's straight herself, and it's one of those things. You're like, okay, why do they send a straight person? But I wouldn't ask that in public. We're just talking frankly here, because we defend the Cuban Revolution. And we don't look at it. We do not want to examine the revolution from U.S. eyes. Our job is to lift the blockade. Our job is to make sure that U.S. imperialism does not intervene in Cuba in any way, because it will only be lifting the blockade that will allow the advances. But it's not perfect. It's not perfect. have to point out this humongous contribution that one of our own comrades made, Leslie Feinberg, on this question. And I encourage everyone to read this, because here it is from a trans person that has experienced the brunt of capitalist exploitation right here, and who traveled to Cuba and saw the advances of the Cuban Revolution made on every question. So with regards to the question about I think it was portals of freedom. Yeah, people protest all the time in Cuba. The only protest that isn't allowed, so to speak, is a grouping of Cubans who are known to work with U.S. infiltrators. Because since 1959, Cuba has been at war. It has been at war. And when you are at war, you have to defend yourself from assassination attempts, from bombs, from bacterial, the U.S. bringing in bacteria to kill people, all of that. So if they find Cubans who go along and play the role of sabotage with imperialists, then yes, if you're protesting from that point of view, then yes, you're going to be arrested, But those are few and far between. It's few and far between, the Cubans that, go along with that. Most of them have left or are leaving. So I remember being in Cuba one time, and supposedly there are sex workers in Cuba. And it's not because, the basic needs have not been met. You have housing, you have a job, you have food, but sometimes people want more. You want glam, you want glitz, you want the money from Miami that white Cubans, more lighter-skinned Cubans send in, to Cubans. And so sometimes women do, work the tourist crowd so they can get, more stay at a fancy hotel, whatever, And Cuban police are supposed to stop the women from doing that because it's whatever reason. And I remember one Cuban cop was trying to stop this woman, and she just basically said, "Get the fuck away," and he just walked off. Nothing happened. She ruled the day, And it's because Cuban police are not capitalist police. They're just, like they may help with. They don't carry guns, and so forth and so on. So it isn't true that Cubans don't have any freedom of speech. They have plenty of freedom of speech. The only thing that isn't allowed is to go along with the imperialists to try to sabotage the revolution, which makes sense. When you're at war, you have to defend yourself. So it isn't true, there's got to be a reason why the U.S. has more people in jail than even China, which has what? How many more people?
4 times.
4 times the people that the U.S. has, and yet U.S. has more prisoners than China, and certainly more prisoners than Cuba. Right? And people can go. I mean, we ought to organize this trip to Cuba to go visit the prisons in Cuba, because there is nothing like it. You visit a prison here and you feel like you're terrorized. That's just visiting, much less being incarcerated in a prison here, because it is the most cruelest system here. In Cuba, you can walk into a prison and there's no metal detectors, there's no, repressive armed guard that fuels you up, because Cuban society is organized under solidarity. It is organized for the people. It is not organized to exploit the way the U.S. and other capitalist corporations are. And that's why the people have said, we will die for our revolution. We will die for our revolution. And that's why the U.S. was able to that's why Cuba was able to bring the U.S. to its knees and get the U.S. president to go there. And any change is because the Cuban Revolution is successful in defending its revolution.